Welcome back to the Mildew Twang Outdoors podcast, where we chronicle our time spent in the Delta, the swamps, the piney woods, and beyond. Here, we share our experiences and stories ranging from simple country living to lesser-known stories of American culture and what all of this means for us as Christians in today's world. Now, folks, before we get started here, this is kind of a forewarning on what's to come. These stories are a little bit sad, and if you don't like Where the Red Fern Grows, Old Yeller, other books about animals and what ultimately happens in our lives, you may want to steer clear of this episode. However, through the experiences that I will tell you, I also learned intimately just what it means to love somebody, to be loved, and what it means to sacrifice. So, this is a beautiful picture of God's love for us. Anyhow, thanks for listening in today. Let's get going. Now, folks, life has a way of passing us by. When you're young, the year lasts forever. Time stands still and you soak in every last second, every detail. And as we age, our memories become more and more short-lived. We feel like we're on a bullet train watching out the window as every fleeting second fades away in the distance. It feels like we're watching an hourglass, and as the sand falls in height, it seems to speed up until the last grain eases through that bottleneck. It's wonderful, isn't it? Not so much. Over the years, I've tried to figure out why life seems to go faster and faster as we age, and this is my conclusion. From 1 year to 2 years old, you double your lifespan on Earth. Every passing day is a huge percentage of your life. From 2 to 4, you again have doubled. From 4 years to 8 years old, 8 to 16, 16 to 32, 32 to 64, and so on. Now, if you live to be 128, you double 64, you are doing incredible. So as we age, every day becomes a smaller and smaller percentage of our overall lifespan. My theory is that as we age, your life, quote, slows down in its speed of aging. I believe that this is what causes every passing moment to seem shorter and shorter. If this makes sense, you may be crazy like me. And if it doesn't, don't stress out much about this concept and live happily, knowing that you are not crazy like I am. Now anyways, on to the important stuff. Just as life passes us by, there will be other things, other people, and other friends that pass us by. What we are left with is a temporary pain that will one day be replaced with glorious memories of joy and happiness. I'll tell you a story now about one such incident. She was born in an old trailer north of Bay Minette, Alabama. This young angel had a half-dozen brothers and sisters and a loving mother who rejoiced at her birth. Her mother knew her place in this world, and she inherently understood her God-given responsibility. You see, every mother has a bond with her children, a bond that drives her to love them, to feed them, to shelter them, and to protect them, and this mother was no different. She lived in an old trailer that, unbeknownst to her, was the site of a terrible production. The production of something called meth. Now, for you young folks, leave it at that. For you folks who are in the know, this was a pretty bad place. One night, late into the eerie darkness, one single spark ignited that trailer, and the mother escaped the inferno with all of her babies. The problem was, however, that she was no longer wanted by that family. In fact, that very family that raised her and helped her give birth stated that she was going to be killed. All of her babies would be shot if she was not taken away. Sad stuff, it really is, and I'm sorry to start out a story with such a numbing intro. In the meantime, a young goofy college kid, I got a call from my buddy Braxton Chastain, Blaine Chastain, aka Night Stalker's son. He asked me to go up to hunt in Bruton, Alabama. Now how could a young redneck say no? If you had seen the pictures of the deer taken from that property, you would have leapt at the chance like I did. I drove down to White House Fork, hopped onto Braxton's old maroon F-150, and off we went into the wild blue yonder, spinning tires like the folks from Dukes of Hazzard. As visions of giant deer were etched into our brains, we left Bay Minette proper and continued up the highway into rural Alabama. Now, the rural Alabama that most of you outsiders picture does indeed exist. Trailers dotting the highway, ag fields and longleaf pine thickets bordering the winding, cracked asphalt road, old pickup trucks and logging vehicles passing you every 15 minutes. We were on just such a road when a mama dog and her babies darted out in front of us. You might have mistaken Braxton for Dale Earnhardt as he promptly swerved out of the way, tapping the brakes and laying the pedal to the metal as we avoided those dogs and gassed it out of there. Now, if you've ever looked at a bright light and then closed your eyes quickly, you'll still see the image of that light, an artifact per se, etched into your retina. This image may persist for several minutes, and it provides a snapshot of time until it fades away. Much in this way, the image of that deep chocolate mama dog and her multicolored babies was instantly etched into my brain. I can still see her and all of her babies the moment she passed by the left tires of that old truck. She was doing the best she could to get away from traffic and from her abusive owners. Now, should we go back and get those dogs? No, man, they'll just be trouble, and we're on track to be up in the deer stand by prime time. I felt slightly nauseated, but we had a plan and we were going to stick to it. Those dogs were not our responsibility, you see. Sadly, our dreams of killing any deer did not come to fruition, but we did attack our late-night cravings with a Whataburger drive-thru dinner. Those honey barbecue chicken sandwiches, I don't know if they still make them, but those things were the bomb, and I think I ate 2, and Braxton probably ate 4 or 5. He's a lot bigger than I was. That night, when I went to sleep, I dreamed of those dogs. I knew they weren't in a good place, and I wished that we would have stopped, especially considering that our hunt was unsuccessful, but hindsight is 20/20. The following weekend, Braxton and I were going hunting again. As we followed the same road, we stopped at an old gas station where we bought root beer and fried pork skins. We were filling up on gasoline when Braxton got a call. "Hey Jay, my aunt picked up some puppies along the road this week. Mama was hit by a car. Do you have any interest in a dog?" "I don't know, man. We don't have room at our house," as I contemplated the situation. However, I decided that I was a mature man now. I was in college. Who cares if I was living at home with my parents? I could do what I wanted to do. Now here's a pro tip for you young folks. Just because you are in college, if you live at home and or you rely on your parents for personal or financial benefit, you are still called to honor and respect them and their wishes. And I did not necessarily take that to heart. "Well, man, are there any female dogs left?" "Well, just one, a deep chocolate. Yeah, a deep chocolate female. Here's a picture." My heart skipped a beat, and the vision etched into my brain from the week before came flooding back. I knew that dog. She was the last one in line behind the mama that crossed the road. She was the runt of the litter, and she needed a home now. So after our hunt, we stopped by his aunt's house so I could see that puppy. As I scooped her up into my right hand, she was so tiny I didn't need two. She nestled her head into my cupped palm and fell asleep. My heart melted and I was instantly a goner. Now you've heard about love at first sight regarding people, but this dog was instantly my entire world. I had on an old, tattered blue Columbia sports hoodie, and I slid that little dog into my kangaroo pouch pocket and walked back to my car. And on the way home, I prayed and prayed that my parents would accept her and that she would get to stay. Now, foreshadowing, she did stay. That mama dog and her babies had a purpose in this world. In fact, all of God's creation does. And had I known what was to come, I never would have believed it. I also never would have guessed how that 11-ounce puppy would change my life. After convincing my parents to let me keep her, I promptly disclosed that her name would be Lily. Her white paw, her mottled white forehead, and her soft eyes reminded me of a blooming flower, and she was here to stay. That first night, she was cold and scared, and I nuzzled my face against hers. That helped keep her warm, and it helped us bond. If you've seen Twilight, you've seen this, folks. What do they call it? Oh, man, there's a word for that. I think it's called imprinting. That's right. It's called imprinting. Now, not that I think you guys should watch Twilight. In fact, I think you should stay far away from it. But I watched it one time with my wife, and the way that the imprinting takes place is the same reaction that I had with this dog here. I couldn't stand to hear her crying, so I had her sleep in my bed in the hood of that Columbia shirt, or Columbia hoodie, surrounded by a ring of pillows to keep her from falling out of bed. And anywhere I went, she went with me. Anything I dealt with, she handled as well. One soul was not affected without the other mirroring that emotion. Over the years, Millie, her new name better reflected her personality, as Millie means gentle strength or strong in work, Millie and I would have countless experiences together. She also decided she was going to outgrow her own body, and that once scared 11-ounce dog would become a 130-pound teddy bear. From the Sandlot, if you've seen the dog Hercules at the end of the movie, Millie was not far removed from being about the same size Hercules was, and she could cuddle, wrestle, love, and speak with me through her eyes and her body language better than any human being alive. Our very first adventures included forays into the woods to trap raccoons and possums, or opossums if you want to spell it right, deep in the woods of Spanish Fort, Alabama, behind the Bergen's house, our fellow church members. I dragged Millie along to set coon traps in the bottomland swamps. There were many times she ended up in the foothold traps whining to get help, all the while ruining my trap sets. But you know what? She never got hurt. She learned her lessons and we had a great time together. And she eventually became just a world-renowned swimmer, a wonderful water dog, but as a puppy she had a strong distaste for water. She would do anything to avoid getting her feet wet. Oftentimes she would stand alongside the wet mud and cry until I gave in and lifted her up on my shoulders to carry her across. That spoiled little princess. Bear in mind, this took place until she was 85 pounds. It took Millie a while to understand the goals of trapping. When we approached her very first raccoon, Millie wasn't more than 20 pounds at the time, and although that old bandit was our mortal enemy, she didn't know what to do. Before I could grab her collar, they tangled up, rolling across the dew-laden leaves, screaming, squalling, and crying, breaking the early morning silence. Now what was a boy to do? I wasn't going to shoot into the rolling ball of fur, so I let them hash it out. Ultimately, Millie killed that coon and escaped with little more than a scratch on her nose. All right, girl, I see what you're made of. And about a year later, we went to West Point, Mississippi to trap a big green patch up that way. We had a big problem with raccoons and possums, and they were eating our turkey eggs. So we made a coyote set in the middle of a big field, and promptly early the next morning, arrived at the field only to see a small black and white striped animal, something you might be thinking of, something you've probably seen on Bambi. Yep, Pepe Le Pew was curled up into a ball. Oh no, Millie, not again. She jumped out of the four-wheeler and ran before I could stop her, and she tangled up with a grade A bona fide skunk. I was proud, but I was also disgusted when that thing sprayed at her. Luckily, the main brunt of the blast missed her. But she went through several baths of tomato paste before the smell was entirely removed. But, from an early age and from that point specifically, she was my hunting and trapping buddy. Now, folks, not everything is rose-smelling all the time. Christmas was Millie's favorite holiday, and it might have been my fault because I would wrap her presents up just like a child's and let her rip the paper open to reveal new stuffed animals, new tennis balls, bones, and all sorts of wonderful things that dogs love. And I failed to mention earlier that Mom and Dad also had several small dogs at the time, a Shih Tzu and a Pekingese Poodle mix. They also had a boxer, but that boxer was old in age and kind of standoffish. He was great, but he kept his distance. Millie was extremely intelligent, but her love for Christmas and her selfish nature and the trapping and hunting that we had done meant that small animals that would get in her way, well, they weren't in a safe place. Penny, our Pekingese poodle, tried to grab a bone from the pile of Christmas presents, and in doing so, like a Tyrannosaurus Rex from Jurassic Park, Millie came bounding up and grabbed Penny by the throat. I quickly reacted, wrapping my arms around Millie's neck and squeezing her jaws open, causing Penny to fall to the floor. Now, on her way down, Millie tried to grab Penny again, and she mistakenly clamped her jaws down on my left hand, putting a hole through the meat between my thumb and my pointer finger. Out of more or less an involuntary reaction, I grabbed Millie by the collar and the back left leg and I threw her across the room into the brick wall. It's not exactly a nice thing to do, but I also had a hole in my hand and our other dog may or may not have been in a bad way. Ultimately, all things turned out okay, but the entire family began to rethink Millie's existence, and we discussed options to rehome her. Prior to doing this, however, we made a deal. God creates all life. He is the master of all things, and as such, He was also Millie's creator. If anybody could change her, it would be God. For weeks, Mom and I would pray over Millie. We would pray for her attitude and her inherent selfish anger to be calmed. We also researched names and realized that the name Lily I gave her did not fit. The meaning behind it, all of that good stuff. We'll leave that out for now, the details on that. But we changed her name from Lily to Millie. And ultimately, her personality did change. One additional part of the deal, though, is that she was no longer allowed to be a hunting and trapping dog while she lived with small dogs at my parents' house. She had begun to confuse small animals with killing, and that was to come to an end. But such is the way of the world, and sometimes things just don't work out. In this case, however, it did work out. With one exception. Millie's last tangle with a wild animal happened later on in my college years. You see, there came a time when I was invited out to Theodore, Alabama for a bonfire with some college friends. Folks from the Jaguar Marching Band at South Alabama. Now, out in Theodore, you could say things were semi-rural, and we were excited to get away from the bustling college campus. Now, being inseparable, I dragged Millie along to chaperone. She always had a nurturing mindset, and I trusted her to provide protection from the Alabama skunk ape should one take a liking to our warm fire. About an hour after dark, Millie wandered off into the dark night, only to start barking, a higher-pitched series of resounding woofs in rapid succession. Whoa, guys, that's kind of unusual. I think she found something. So off we go, tracking her down, la-di-da-di-da, and when I do see her, the gnarled old tail of an armadillo is sticking out of a hole in the ground. Millie has it pinned tight, her teeth right against its flanks. I guess armadillos have flanks. I don't know. This backside, whatever you call that. Now, again, I'm a redneck here, so what do you think I did? Well, I sent my buddy Dane back to the truck to grab his bow, and me, being a brave and stupid soul, I wrapped my hand tight around that armored possum's tail, and I pulled with all my might. Like a wine cork, that armadillo let go all at once, and I fell backwards. That armadillo landed on top of me, Millie right behind him. As she snapped around, it came to my attention that I still had a tight grip on that tail. I stood up and raised that joker well above my head, which was, again, not a smart thing to do because he was thrashing and kicking. He did his best imitation of the flying cobra kung fu style. Millie was jumping up and down, snapping her jaws close to his head when I lost my grip. Down he fell, and down Millie went. Mind you, I forgot to say that we were in a fenced yard. But what this means is that the armadillo had nowhere to go. So for 10 minutes, Millie chased that armadillo, and I chased Millie back and forth, back and forth. It was almost like a demented game of soccer, but nobody actually got a foot on the armadillo or on Millie. Eventually, that little guy found a hole in the fence and escaped. And even so, that was one of the most memorable events from college. Over everything that you guys could imagine happened, catching that armadillo was the best. Except for the time when I brought a coyote and a beaver to school, but my poor professors must have thought I was a special person. And many would say that they remembered exams or parties, relationships and friends, personal growth and mistakes, but I remember spending time with my best friend, Millie. There came a day when I began to take an interest in a lovely gal named Brittany. That gal would date me, and we would go on to be married in 2019. Now, while that story is wonderful in of itself, the main component of that story that you guys might not have known is that Millie was very protective and jealous of women being around me. Had I paid attention to her during my dating years, Millie, she knew outright that all the lady folks I brought around were not right for me, and she would have spared me from many different situations that I shouldn't have been in the first place. Now, her body language and her attitude distinctly showed me this fact, but I ignored her. Ha! And it wasn't until I began to date Brittany that she came around to accepting the new lady of my life. Quote, quote. Over time, Millie accepted Brittany, and Brittany accepted Millie, although she was initially hesitant of being around such a large dog, Brittany that is. For the first time in her life, Millie had a mama. The relationship that Brittany had with Millie blossomed into that reminiscent of a loving mother and daughter, aka loving caretaker, while mine was always more like that of a father. There are so many components of Millie's story, so many situations that I would like to tell you, it's hard to pick and choose just what to share. One thing that set her apart is, in my opinion, her nurturing attitude. While I initially rescued her and I raised her, nurturing her to be a respectful and obedient dog, it was not until she was well up in age that I realized she had been nurturing me. Just as much as I was her father figure, she became a second mother to me. What I left out during the beginning of this podcast is that during my time in college, I maintained many jobs, I had friends, I was involved in church, but I was deep down a very angry person. I went through bouts of sadness and depression, and Millie was my saving grace. No longer did I have to sit and study alone. No longer did I have an excuse to ignore my Bible. I had a best friend and a passive mentor with me at all times watching. Together we would read the Bible, we would pray, I would study with her, and when my grandfather passed, she let me cry on her neck. And because of her immense size, I could squeeze with all my might to release my emotion, and she wouldn't be fazed. Throughout her life, Millie would go on to do many great things, and she would support me through all of them. In a roundabout way, she would graduate college and become a civil engineer. She would work as a youth pastor and see the salvation of many different young men and women. She helped rebuild my very first home, becoming a carpenter and a handyman, handywoman. She would pass the PE test and become a fully licensed engineer. She would support our family during the passing of my grandmother and my grandfather. She helped pick out my wife. She would never judge my mistakes. She taught me to love unconditionally, and before her passing, she would see me become an ordained deacon in church. Granted, it was me doing these things, but she was my partner in crime for everything that I did. Now, I'm speaking in the past tense because, as I briefly mentioned at the beginning of the story, and if you had been listening to the context clues, life will pass us by. The pain caused by her passing is partially what slowed this podcast down. Now, that's not the only reason. I got lazy and distracted with some other things that you'll hear about later, but it put a damper on my spirits in light of this podcast. It left a hole in my heart that you can only understand if you have a deep connection with animals, as evidenced by Wilson Rawls and his books Old Yeller and Where the Red Fern Grows. Even though she is no longer here, the unconditional love she gave me is the first time that I've truly experienced Christ's love for us, for me, for all of us. On the day that she passed, I had to pick up my baby and carry her to the car because the bone cancer had spread beyond any hope of treatment. The pain I felt that morning, knowing I had to carry her outside, brought me to my knees, and I nearly passed out in the living room. Brittany had to lift me back up while I lifted Millie up. However, all of that being said, all of the sad stuff that came to pass, none of that is anything in comparison to God's sacrifice of His Son for us. But through that moment, through all of Millie's life, through her death and having to take her to the veterinarian clinic, I began to comprehend the grief and the pain that God went through, knowing that He had to send His own Son to die for a lost world. Just as Millie done her entire life, she once again showed me what it means to love God, what all God had done for us. She showed me the weight of God's glory and the weight of salvation. Beyond asking you to consider these things, the weight of salvation, the weight of God's glory through Jesus Christ, I don't have anything else profound to say about this podcast. Now, I have a million stories, and I would love to tell you all of them, but there are a lot of things that we just don't have time for with this. However, as we move forward with our show, I will continue to update you guys with stories from time to time. And it won't be every week like it was early this year, but I'll make sure to stay up to date with my podcasts. Thank you for your time and all that you guys do. Love in Christ.